It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC, live from the Green Space today. And when we are in the Green Space, you can watch the Brian Lehrer Show as well as listen. Just go to the live streaming video on our website or on the WNYC Facebook page or on our Twitter feed. And we have a great lineup in the Green Space today, radio worth watching. The president of New York City Transit, Andy Byford, will be here. He is signing on to Governor Cuomo's new plan for the L train, but he also has questions about it, so we will try to clarify that and talk about other bus and subway things too. Ian Bremmer, who's got a take on what Trump's economic nationalism and withdrawal from global leadership might mean for the economy. Pianist, composer, and band leader Arturo O'Farrell will play the piano live for us later here in the Green Space and talk about his concert featuring live musicians in the U.S. and Mexico at the same time, called Fandango at the Wall. All of that is coming up, but here's how we start. For all the focus on Democrats taking control of the House of Representatives for the first time in a decade and Nancy Pelosi taking over as Speaker, there is a parallel reality here in New York with perhaps as many implications for your own life. Democrats also won control on Election Day of the New York State Senate for the first time in a decade, with Andrea Stewart-Cousins taking over as Senate Majority Leader on the Senate's first day, which was yesterday.
Sometimes, even in seemingly progressive places like New York, barriers still exist. We are going to break down some more barriers.
So what could change? New York's rent laws, New York's voting laws, New York's abortion laws, New York's immigration laws, New York's health insurance laws, New York's bail and evidence laws, New York's marijuana laws, a congestion pricing law, the balance of how the schools are funded, how much the church is protected from consequences for past priest-child sex abuse, and Albany's ethics laws. Okay, maybe not that one.
Yes, that one too.
Liz Krueger says that one too. But seriously, every single thing on that list is considered seriously in play, and most of them between now and April 1st, when the next state budget is due. We are very happy to have with us here in the Green Space two important members of that new Democratic majority. State Senator Liz Krueger from Manhattan's East Side. She's been in the Senate since 2002. And brand new State Senator John Liu. His district is Northeast Queens, from basically Flushing and Fresh Meadows out to the Nassau County line. Yes, this is the same John Liu who was the New York City Comptroller. He defeated Tony Avella, one of the breakaway Democrats from the group called the IDC, who had helped Republicans maintain control of the Senate in the past. So, Senator Krueger, welcome back to WNYC. And John Liu, welcome back for the first time as Senator Liu.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Brian.
So, Senator Liu, what do you think the voters of Northeast Queens were saying by electing you over Tony Avella and throwing out almost all the IDC members in all the districts in their Democratic primaries? Even though it was Democrats against Democrats, this seemed to a lot of us to have something to do with the era of Trump.
Oh, that absolutely had to do a lot with it. First, let me say that I am very proud to represent Northeast Queens, the 11th district in the state Senate. And it actually is pretty much everything in Northeast Queens except Flushing.
Oh.
Just a little bit of Flushing, but most of it goes from College Point out to Little Neck and Douglaston, and then down to Belrose and Queens Village, and some parts of Fresh Meadows and Jamaica Estates. But it is a big area, and the people in that district are very much concerned about what's happened in these last couple of years. I will say that, I ran against Tony, who I've known for a long time. 4 years ago, I lost to him by a little bit. This time I was able to get it. And in large part, the major difference was this awareness that the current occupant of the White House has brought upon the entire country, and certainly the people in Northeast Queens as well. So I'm very delighted and honored to have the privilege.
And Senator Krueger, what was it like at the Capitol yesterday on day one with a solid Democratic majority and Andrea Stewart-Cousins as majority leader suddenly in place?
I was asked that question yesterday by a reporter, and I didn't really think, and I said, I feel blissful, and I've never felt that way in Albany before. Because when Andrea was making her speech on the floor of the Senate and listing out the issues that we were going to take on and accomplish, and you listed many of them in your opening, Brian. For me, these were all of the things I went to Albany to try to accomplish 16 years ago. And I was drafted. I didn't actually want to run. That's another story. But it was because of my belief that we had to do those things. So to have a leader who was going to be controlling what bills came to the floor, who was making a master list of our goals that had been my goals since before I got there, was so exciting. I'm not known to be like incredibly cheerful all the time when I'm in Albany. I'm always an optimist. I don't think you can do this work if you're not an optimist. But it was just such happiness, and also an incredible team. I'm excited about every single Democratic senator. And I have never said that before either.
So let's go down some of the items on the list that I read and see what you each think is important and what might be contentious. First, I was only half kidding about the ethics laws. There is already a dispute, as you know, over Governor Cuomo's commission decision to give you all a pay raise for the first time in many years, but to restrict outside income and restrict special pay for being on certain committees. And the commission decided that that was relevant to Albany's corruption problems. What do each of you want to see happen? Senator Krueger, I'll stay with you on this since you've been obviously involved in this for years.
Okay. So I certainly think the legislature deserved a raise. It had been 20 years. Nobody goes 20 years without a raise. I've always supported ending outside income. I understand the argument that the commission did not necessarily have the authority to do that. I think we should just pass legislation now to do the exact same thing, to make it clear that it is with the intent of the legislature to end outside jobs. But I understand there are disagreements on that. And they did away with Lulus, but I've also always opposed Lulus. I don't take a Lulu in the past.
Remind people what Lulu stands for. It's short for...
It's a payment in lieu of a pay. I can't remember what the actual LU stands for. Do you?
No, it actually is an acronym for the in lieu of.
In lieu of.
Yes.
Thank you, John.
I personally prefer people not use that particular
That
acronym,
particular Lulu.
Yeah.
Touche. So I've never been a supporter of them and haven't taken them. And so then we end up with a commission who says nobody gets them except the leader. And I get the argument. Leaders work 24/7. And the finance chairs, and I'm the finance chair. So I immediately got asked, so you're going to be the only one with a Lulu? I go, well, that might be, but I don't take Lulu. So nope, won't be me either.
Is Senator Liu for Lulus?
I've already said that I wouldn't accept the extra stipend for being a committee chair.
Good use of the thesaurus.
Well, that's actually what it's technically called. There's nothing in the law that says Lulu. Okay, the stipend is now going to be eliminated, which I agree with. I support. I also support the ban on outside income or severe limitations on that. Although I will say, this so-called pay raise is going to cost me personally a lot of money.
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, my overall income will go down dramatically.
Just by being in the Senate compared to the private sector.
Yes. I mean, I'm privileged, and I want to be in the Senate.
The previous, just before we get off ethics, the previous Democratic Assembly Speaker, Sheldon Silver, and the previous Republican Senate Majority Leader, Dean Skelos, have both been convicted on corruption charges. So were these two bad apples who happened to be at the tops of their trees, or is there a systemic legal corruption problem that Albany has yet to confront? Senator Liu, what do you think?
I think there's a culture that has been that has had momentum and inertia for a very long time, and so we do need to change the culture, beginning with some of the ethics laws. And I'm a strong proponent of not only banning the outside income and eliminating stipends, as we already talked about, but also much fuller disclosures on campaign contributions. I am for public financing of campaigns to take the big money out of campaigns, and whatever we can do to, if we don't necessarily restrict everything under the sun, at least there should be much greater transparency. The public should know, and this entity called JCOPE, which I think is not a truly independent entity, that entity should be strengthened and made more independent so that it can truly go after possible corruption and ethics violations in not just the legislature, but also in the executive chamber.
Listeners, we can take phone calls for our two guests from the New York State Senate on the day after Democratic control officially came to the New York State Senate. We'll see what they can get accomplished over time. What do you want to ask them here right at the outset? 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692 for Senator Krueger from Manhattan and Senator Liu from Queens, 212-433-9692. And audience here in the green space, raise your hand, and someone will come around with a microphone. So, Senator Krueger, I see the first bill that might be number one as early as next week could be one that would expand voting in New York State. What's likely to be new about voting in New York State?
Well, I'm hoping that we actually pass a package of bills next week relating to increasing the public's ability to vote. So we're talking about early voting, where people will have multiple days that they can go into polling sites in their district and vote. I mean, having it only on Tuesday and only, in very crowded, in some situations, availability is a real problem. We're also going to try to make registering to vote easier. We are also going to hopefully combine the congressional and the state primaries into one day. So we're the only state in the nation where you do primaries for congressional reps, one in June, and you do primaries for state reps in September. That means twice as many elections, and it's starting to feel like, and half as many people voting, because it's like, what do you mean there's a primary? What do you mean there's another primary? What am I doing? So that's just, we want to go to electronic ballot books, which will allow people to more easily get directed to where they're supposed to vote. There's all online registration. There are many, many changes, and I think we're going to pass a package of bills next week.
The governor was also talking about this this week, so it seems like there's confluence on this. It's not going to be controversial in the Democratic Assembly, Democratic Senate, and with the governor enthusiastic. Senator Liu, anything you want to add about the voting bill or any possible hitches that you see on details?
I think there are some objections, possibly from Republican senators. I don't necessarily want to get into that. I'm very optimistic, as is Senator Krueger, that this package of voting reform bills will be passed. And the goal is, not to necessarily to get. There are obviously details we have to get into, and Senator Krueger's talked about some of those details. But we want to make it easier for people to vote. We don't want to be at the very bottom of this entire country in terms of voter turnout. We just want people to vote. Vote! Damn it, vote!
Republicans will shout at you. May applaud for voting. It's okay. Republicans will shout potential voter fraud, even if that shout is a fraud in itself for the most part. Yes. But if you have same-day registration and no voter ID, how do you stop people who aren't actually eligible from casting ballots? Because that question will come up.
So we've looked at, please. We've looked at what other states are doing. Almost every state in this country has some better voting laws than we do. And all of the proposals we're going to be hopefully voting on next week have implementation in many states around the country. National studies have shown that voter fraud by fake ID, fake going into, say, I'm Liz Krueger when I'm really Brian Lehrer, and voting is simply not a problem. Think about it. Do you know how many people you would need to do that to have the impact on an election? If you're going to commit voter fraud, you hack into electronic systems and steal 100,000 votes. You don't get 4 people to try to do fake ID in order to have the right to vote. It's just a fake argument.
And just one other thing on this, early voting. If this gets through as you're seeing it, how early would the election season begin in New York? Do you know, excuse me, do you know, either of you?
I think we're only talking about within a week difference.
That's all? Just a week of early
I believe
voting?
So.
Yeah, it's
a
number
quite
of days.
Quite a few weeks in some places.
Right. And there's been some research that shows you don't want to do it so early that people haven't had the time to learn the things they should be learning about the candidates, right? So a lot of candidates' models, and it makes sense, is you're putting your heavy emphasis on educating people about, I'm John Liu and I'm running for the Senate, at the very end, right before voting.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So you don't want to make voting so early that people don't have a chance to learn all these things about John Liu.
It's interesting. I used to say in presidential elections, I'm not sure if it's as true in local elections, but on around October 1st, just stop paying attention to the news because you know everything you need to know about these two presidential candidates or any third-party candidates, and it's just going to be bottom-feeding October surprises after that.
Right.
And, of course, after I said that in 2016, then came the Access Hollywood tape.
That's right.
Then came all the Russian email dumps, and they both had tremendous effects on the election. So for better or worse. I think we have a question here in the green space. Hi there.
Hi. Good morning, and thank you for taking my question. John, it's great to see you back in the Senate. Congratulations on capturing the Senate chamber now for Democrats. I know there's a backlog of bills that you're all anxious to pass, a lot of different priorities. One in particular that I've been involved with is the Farm Worker Justice Act. It's been languishing for the past 20 years plus. It really deserves the support of the people here in New York State and now the state Senate, and it would involve giving farm worker protections that they were denied back during the Jim Crow days. So how about that? How about supporting that bill and making sure that the state Senate supports that bill as well?
So I can only speak for myself. I've always been a supporter of that bill. Obviously, the Republican-controlled Senate was never going to take it up. It's not actually a bill we've conferenced yet, simply because we had one official day yesterday, and there's been lots and lots of discussions about lots of different legislation, but that one hasn't come up for even a discussion yet with new members, so I don't even want to guess positions for anyone but myself.
In fact, I got a press release yesterday from the Assembly Speaker, Carl Hastie, who's excited that the Senate, too, is now finally Democrat-controlled and listing many bills that the Assembly already supported, but the Republican Senate wouldn't. The list is of many things we've been talking about, but I also noticed some things that were not on Speaker Hastie's list. Ethics reform was not on the list. Rent reform was not on the list. New York State single payer was not on the list. And legalizing recreational marijuana was not on the list. Do you think any of those four things, we already talked about ethics, do you think any of the other things will be easy to pass now that there's full Democratic control? Senator Liu?
I mean, I think we're certainly going to take up rent control. That expires. There's a time frame on that, and
the current rent laws expire at the end of June.
June 15th.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, I can't imagine that we're going to leave the session without extending it or changing it or even strengthening it in some form or fashion. For example, repealing vacancy decontrol. I mean, I don't want to get into specifics because there's going to be lots of negotiations going on, but I can't imagine that we're going to let that completely lapse as it did a number of years ago for a few months.
Right. Well, let me ask you about that particular one, because it's probably the biggest individual item there, vacancy decontrol, which allows landlords to flip apartments from rent stabilized to market rate pretty easily when they become vacant. An article in the Times today reminds us the real estate industry has its campaign finance hooks in Democrats as well as Republicans, and in fact upped their campaign donations to Democrats when it became clear that the Senate would go Democratic majority. Are you both for ending vacancy decontrol?
Yes.
Yes. And by the way, I think we will also take up closing the LLC loophole next week, which has been the mechanism by which certain industries, most obviously real estate, have used to put enormous contributions into members from both parties. So we think it's a crucial opening statement to get rid of that loophole right away.
That loophole, in short, being that each corporate entity has a limit on the number of dollars it can contribute to a political campaign, but the kind of company called an LLC, somebody could just set up an endless number of LLCs, and each one can contribute that
for the
maximum,
purpose of
right?
making these contributions.
Yes.
But they can even set up fake ones. And they get to use individual maximums, not corporate maximums. So a giant corporation, Coca-Cola, could only spend $5,000 in total in a New York State election cycle for all candidates. But an individual LLC that you might have never heard of or might not even really exist beyond paper could hand the maximum to every single senator, which is $11,000.
18 including the primary.
Right, 18 including a primary. And they could hand over $60,000 to each statewide. So, as was a major storyline in the Skelos and Silver trials, these particular companies through LLCs were giving hundreds of thousands of dollars to each of these people and directing them, don't let the rent regulation laws be strengthened.
If you're just tuning in, it's the Brian Lehrer Show live in the Green Space today. Our first two guests are state senators Liz Krueger from Manhattan and John Liu in Queens on the historic occasion of the Senate officially going to majority Democratic control yesterday as senators were sworn in, just as the House of Representatives, with Pelosi becoming Speaker, was a historic day last week. The New York State Senate going Democratic for the first time in many years, with Andrea Stewart Cousins being sworn in, also historic, and so many policy items now open for possible change in New York that weren't before. We have another question here in the green space. Let's go to that person. Hi there.
Hi, loyal disciple of your show, Brian.
Thank you.
Hoping, as a personal request, you could put peer pressure on Preet Bharara to run for public office someday. Thank you both for being here. My question is in regard to Mayor de Blasio's announcement about this new healthcare program specific to New York City. As a young person dealing with oppressive debt, with this new, with the election, I was hoping that single payer was something that would be taken up in Albany. So I'm wondering if you both could elaborate on Mayor de Blasio's announcement, and to what extent might that be incongruous with whatever you might be discussing in Albany?
Right. The mayor's, and for background for our listeners, the mayor announced a kind of, I think it's fair to call it, a few new patches on the health system in New York City that could wind up providing healthcare funding for everybody in the city if everybody takes advantage of it. And one of the downsides of that, some people have argued, is that it places less pressure on the legislature than there was, Senator Krueger, to pass the single-payer state healthcare system bill that the majority of the Assembly has already passed, and a lot of the state senators, including yourself in the past, have said you support.
Brian, maybe I can talk a little bit about this. I mean, this was a very exciting announcement by the mayor just a couple of days ago. I have to admit I was a little bit surprised to hear it. It's very ambitious. It sounds great. But I have to be skeptical about it, because this is something that we've been talking about in the Democratic Conference, in the state Senate, and it's an issue that many of us want to take up. I look forward to seeing the details from the mayor's plan. It's ambitious. It sounds great. I was very excited when Fair Fares came out. And obviously, there was a lack of detail about how anybody could sign up for that. So let's see how this actually works. And if he did, in fact, come up with a brilliant proposal that we can extend on a statewide basis, then more power to the mayor.
So you're not, are you for the idea of a statewide single-payer bill? That's the Richard Godfrey
Absolutely.
bill that would actually abolish all private health insurance in New York.
I am absolutely for single-payer health care. You know, the biggest problem, and this I'm just speaking for myself now, because we have lots of discussions about this almost on a daily basis. Healthcare in this country, I think the biggest problem with healthcare is that administrative costs still continue to take up 30 to 40% of every healthcare dollar that is spent, and that is just ridiculous. I mean, paying for paperwork instead of getting people healthy. So that is the overall goal, to finally recognize healthcare as a human right, as a right that everybody should have, just like the right to not be hungry, the right not to be homeless. But But it's going to cost a lot of money if it's not done right. So we have to put all the details together. And that's why I'm excited to hear about the mayor's plan because, we're talking about 8.5 million people in this city. Who is it really going to cover? What kind of benefits will it actually provide? And how will it be administered? So these are the details that have to go into putting together a comprehensive plan that can actually work and be sustainable for the long term.
One of our guests yesterday was the universal healthcare advocate, Elizabeth Benjamin from the Community Service Society, and she was enthusiastic about the mayor's plan.
But it really isn't what should happen. What should happen is major change in Albany, and that's where we really guarantee coverage for all immigrants through either an expansion of our essential plan or a young adult program.
So is something like that on the docket, Senator Krueger?
Yeah. So I'm very glad you had Elizabeth Benjamin on yesterday because I shared John Liu's personal views that if the mayor's come up with a plan that offers more coverage, fabulous. The price tag I heard stated seemed mathematically impossible to get us to our goals, but again, the subways apparently don't need money to get fixed nowadays either.
Well, it was incredibly low. It was $100 million. The mayor said $100 million a year to fully fund health care for the 600,000 uninsured New York City residents. Right. Now, if you do the math, that's only about $150 a year per person.
Right, so that was why, and John was the city controller, so I love to work with him because I think we both were like, we're having trouble understanding the math.
$100 million.
$100 million. But it also is true, as probably Elizabeth Benjamin pointed out yesterday, I couldn't listen, sorry, about a third of the people who are not currently receiving insurance in the state of New York actually are eligible for Medicaid, but just haven't gone ahead and applied through the marketplace. So I'd like to do a quick sort of pitch. If you don't have insurance or you can't afford the insurance you have, you need to check out the New York State marketplace because it's very possible you are eligible for much less expensive, even better insurance. And don't just walk through life without insurance. The second universe is undocumented immigrants, and there's actually a way for New York State to come up with a plan that would cover most undocumented immigrants. So for those of you who might not love the discussion of undocumented immigrants, I will argue if everybody's living here, whatever their legal status, I don't want them sick. Because when they get sick, I will get sick too. I want good public health for everyone. So I do think universal single payer is the right answer. I support the Dick Gottfried Gustavo Rivera proposal, and they are busy working through how they explain to 212 legislators that the math actually does work. But I don't think it's $100 million.
We're almost out of time. There are so many issues that we could get to. As we cited on the long list at the beginning of things that may get seriously considered in Albany, now that there's Democratic control of both the Senate as well as the Assembly. Very briefly, recreational marijuana, are you both for legalizing it, and do you see it relatively sailing through in this session? Senator Krueger.
Carry the bill, and have been carrying it for 4 years with Crystal Peoples-Stokes in the Assembly. I'm pretty confident that this year we'll see some real movement. I am very confident the governor is going to introduce it as part of his budget package. Crystal and I and many, many activists and advocates have been working closely with the governor's office to figure this out. And as recently as 2 days ago, I asked his office to confirm I'm going to see this in the budget, and they said yes. It doesn't mean it will get through the budget process. I think lots of people still have questions and concerns, and I certainly want to try to answer them all. But even if he puts it into the budget, it's an enormous signal, if it pulls out, for us to try to push forward with the bills we have in both houses and to get it done on the floor.
Senator Liu, are you for it? And what's the biggest question you think needs to be resolved?
I'm for it. I think it's going to get done. I think the biggest question is exactly how it's going to be rolled out in the state. And I think it's not that different from the way we regulate alcohol. We just use some of the rules and regulations that we use to regulate alcohol. Obviously, not every single one, but the general structure, then I think it will work. And I support it, but I've never smoked it, and I don't plan to try.
All right, I did smoke it, but it was the last time I was age 19, and I'm not planning to go back.
At least you didn't say you did it inhale.
Oh, no, I inhaled, Brian.
Last thing. Is that the applause of everybody? Senator Liu, before you go, since you're a representative from Queens, do you want to see the Amazon deal scrapped, as some Queens lawmakers do?
Look, I'd love to see 25,000 great-paying jobs and highly skilled jobs for New Yorkers. But why do we have to spend $3 billion on it? I mean, we can spend $3 billion on so many other things. And the reality is, I think they would come anyway.
Is it a done deal?
I don't think it's a done deal.
Does the state legislature have any power over it?
Absolutely. I think you can ask our deputy leader, Mike Gianaris. And I think he's got many state senators who understand the real issues there. I certainly do.
He represents Long Island City.
Yes, it would be in his district. And so, I don't think it's a done deal by any stretch.
There's a bill, Senator Krueger? Something you could
Well, there's
pass?
not a... Well, there's a couple of bills. Mike Gianaris has called for a bill to have full transparency of any of these deals. But the question is, would that be retroactive? The kinds of role we can play... The governor's proposal changes a tax credit for Amazon. The legislature needs to approve changes in tax credits. The governor cannot do that on his own. There's something called the Public Authorities Control Board. When monies go through that, the land use control that was built into the Amazon deal, where you skip New York City having any say, the Public Authorities Control Board has 3 voters. The majority leader of the Senate, the Speaker of the Assembly, the governor. It has to be all 3 yes. It has to be unanimous. So it's not so easy to get to unanimous when something's very controversial. Right. So there's a number of bites at the apple that Albany has, so to speak.
Please thank State Senator John Liu from Queens and State Senator Liz Krueger from Manhattan. Thank you both so much for coming in person to the Green Space.